Alright, folks, this is Acid Roots. I'm going to review Dr. Dre's compilation album, Dr. Dre Presents the Aftermath. Now, the thing about this album is it has some secret Dr. Dre songs on here, and it was supposed to be like a stopgap kind of project between The Chronic and 1992's The Chronic, and then 1999's 2001. So, I mean, basically, that was about all of the 90s that he took off. And a lot of things happened. I mean, Doggy Style came out, Dog Food came out, the Friday soundtrack came out, all these different things. Tupac's All Eyes on Me. Lots of stuff that Dr. Dre was kind of affiliated throughout the 90s, but he never quite reached a point where he was going to say, okay, it's time for me to step back in. I mean, he did a lot of side work, executive producing, guest verses, and shit like that, but we never quite got the Chronic 2. And I kind of wish that before he left Death Row that he would have given them one last album before departing. I definitely think it was a possibility that it could have happened. I have no clue. I mean, I'm thinking that that's a pretty closely guarded secret as to why Dr. Dre did not have a follow-up record while he was still on Death Row, because he made Death Row like in 91 or early 92, and he left in like early 96. So he was there for about 5 years, never put anything else out, and most of the time he was always very off to the side and very, very faint touches of what he would do in terms of his appearances on these albums. So that's kind of a disappointment, but Dr. Dre has always been one of the largest figures in hip hop, so he pretty much almost has the right to do that. But so this album, like I said, is just like a stopgap kind of impression. But unfortunately, the thing about it is it's also rather lousy, just because although it's the first release on the Aftermath, this was before he knew Eminem. Couldn't quite get Snoop Dogg on there because he was still with Death Row, and there's really not many help. There's not much guest appearances that come in cohesive kinds of help on this project. So no Snoop Dogg, no Tupac, no Nate Dogg, no Ice Cube, no Dog Pound, no any of those guys. I mean, anyone that was kind of someone that was a frequent collaborator with Dr. Dre, most of those folks were still on Death Row when he dropped this in late 96. So it was just kind of the way I looked at it. I had to say, well, what does this project have going for it? Because in the past, I thought that the only good song on this whole 16-song project was just Been There, Done That by Dr. Dre. But luckily, when I bought this record, and I did an unboxing of it early in 2019, but there are a handful of other records worth checking out. It just is very light. It's just like a light Dr. Dre album, the Diet Dr. Dre album, and he actually is on here more than one time, but he only drops really two verses, or two songs only two songs have Dr. Dre verses on them. So that just is kind of the thing. So it's a Diet Dr. Dre album, but there is a mild amount of talent that makes this at least worth purchasing just for completionist's sake. But it's not a full-blown banger, and it's definitely not a hit album. So I'll talk about the singles, which would be the first song, Been There, Done That, which has Dr. Dre, and Wikipedia says that this song came out in early September of 1996, before Tupac died. So maybe that was like his response, as far as like, because Tupac was dissing him on the 7 Day Theory album, and I guess Dr. Dre kind of had to pick up and say, well, fuck gangster rap, I've moved on beyond that. It would have been interesting to kind of see how some of that happened, but that's kind of the way it was. So apparently that came out earlier in 96 than I had thought. It's a pretty mellow Dr. Dre song. I mean, there's plenty. I mean, Dr. Dre used to put out a song every year back in the 90s with like, he was on Natural Born Killas in 94, and he was on the Keep the Heads Ringin' and on the Friday soundtrack in 95, and 96 he was on No Diggity and stuff like that, and this was basically like the 97 Dr. Dre songs that came out so late. But it's just very, it's off key. I don't know how much Dr. Dre performs this song or how much attention it really grabs. It's just so bottom tier. It's so bottom tier out of everything that Dr. Dre's kind of done. So it's just it's not a bad song, and the production's definitely above decent, but it's not the first Dr. Dre song I would recommend when talking about him, especially with his relatively trim kind of discography. So that's, but it is a decent little song, but it's the only real full blown Dr. Dre song on here, which is kind of, I mean, he does that at times. He does that at times, but I really would have liked something else, like him doing a guest verse. And really, like I said, there's no one else to kind of back him up and be like the second best rapper on this album. So everyone else was basically on death row, so he couldn't really get any other outside help. And this was before he met Eminem, so there's really nothing he could do at this stage. I mean, there are other performers on here, but they're incredibly pedestrian. And that's just the whole thing about that. But the second single is East Coast, West Coast Killas, which also talks about the beef that was kind of going on. So you get two West Coast rappers, two East Coast rappers. KRS-One and Nas are the East Coast, and Be Real and RBX are West Coast. And thing about it is I forgot to mention this, but RBX was on the Chronic, and he's about the only person that Dr. Dre used to be affiliated with that comes through on this project. So he's on two songs. Both of the songs RBX are on are outstanding, and we'll cover that in a little bit, but this is good. I mean, I'm glad that this gave RBX some extra light. Be Real nailed it. So, I mean, I don't listen to this song that commonly, but it's still a stellar song just in terms of if you haven't heard it, it's worth checking out. So it's worth, it may, just between the Dr. Dre song and this song, it may be, these two songs alone, it may be worth purchasing just within that right. So really paying $6 for this is not too bad just to get two relatively decent songs. And that's basically it for the promotion. So I got to the second single, but the second single didn't chart. And of course, Dr. Dre was really not on this album besides one other song. So it felt really kind of like a rushed and half-baked effort. I mean, it was enough to kind of put out in stores, but even then, it really wasn't. I mean, it doesn't feel like as quite as professional as it probably needed to. I mean, especially with the touch of Dr. Dre, you would almost think that he would have had at least two or three or four songs that he would have been on just to make sure that it was top notch, because he's a perfectionist, but this did not have such execution. But now to talk about like the songs I recommend to you. So out of 16 songs, there's only 6 that I enjoyed, and one of which is just an intro. But I'll go ahead and list those for you now. So Been There, Done That with Dr. Dre, Blunt Time, which is performed entirely by RBX, but then it also has Roger Troutman. So if you don't know who he is, he's a singer that was on Tupac's California Love. He did the vocoder and auto tune before T-Pain and all these other cats that are doing it now. He was like an originator of doing that, and he's outstanding on this song. I mean, I'm so glad that Dr. Dre did another song with him before he passed, because Roger Troutman really knew how to sing. And that's kind of the situation. If Dr. Dre would have done a verse on this song, I probably would have upped the score, because he needed to be on this song, but he wasn't. This has the best beat on the whole album. It's really haunting. RBX really comes through, but it probably should have had Dr. Dre. But East Coast, West Coast, Killas is song number 3. Aftermath, the intro. Uh, that's an interesting intro. I'm starting to like intros more on albums the more I listen to them. I didn't used to listen to intros as much, but this is a decent one. Uh, Got Me Open by Hands On, but this has a verse by Dr. Dre, and that's probably one of the. I mean, I don't know who Hands On is, because it didn't seem like they really got that large, but uh, they're an R&B group, and I liked hearing Dr. Dre for the second time, so that combination results in a decent song. Doesn't have the best beat, and it's kind of awkward R&B, but it feels like something that Biggie would have hopped on back in the 90s, or some random rappers that did like the, Method Man or something like that. Dr. Dre basically does a little bit of R&B, and then Shitting on the World was song number 6. So That's performed by Mailman, who was also on later Dr. Dre records. But I really didn't like this beat, but it's just a decent song. This should showcase like one of the more awkward songs on this album that still loads better than everything else that's on here. And but I can't give this like B level or A level music. It's probably like C minus music, but it's still just barely enough that has just a faint touch of charm to say maybe on an off day or something I would listen to this record. But that's the thing. I mean, really the main three records I would listen to almost usually would be Been There, Done That, Blunt Time, and East Coast, West Coast Killas. But there is just barely enough to kind of say maybe on like an off day or just a random mellow kind of day you might listen to some other ones, but this is really does not have a lot to speak of that's really noteworthy. So I'm gonna give this album a 4 out of 10 just because there is some stuff on here, but because it's Dr. Dre, I was disappointed just in the execution. Because after giving us like the Chronic, Doggy Style, Dog Food, those type records, the Murder Was the Case soundtrack, I don't know how he lost the touch that he had throughout the early 90s. And so it has something to kind of wonder what went on. I mean, I know he was making a new record label and it would eventually house Eminem and stuff and 50 Cent and people like them. But way back in 1996, it really felt like he was just kind of walking blindly and taking shots in the dark, and a lot of them were missing. So that's just kind of the situation. I mean, obviously, with that analogy, you would think that that makes sense, but I mean, I do think, for him to I mean, I don't know. It just felt like there was a real empty kind of affair with trying to find some new full blown talent. And before Eminem, it seemed like Dr. Dre was just going to be maybe almost a has been. So I think the stuff he found in the 2000s decade definitely helped him. But before Eminem in 1998, it was kind of like, it was wishy-washy as to what was going to happen to Dr. Dre. So the social score gets like a 5. I'll just give it a halfway point because it has a mellow Dr. Dre song and then a second single that didn't even chart. It does have a Nas verse, a B Real verse, a KRS-One verse, and so on, but it's kind of another awkward song that you just don't hear in everyday conversation. So it's decent, but it's not like you're going to want to go out of your way to say, well, I'm going to drive halfway across town to go and pick up this album because of that song. So that's just kind of the thing. But yeah, so 4 out of 10, 5 social. Basically, little bit, approximately lukewarm Dr. Dre.